Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. One of the conversations that Joel and I have been having a lot recently is around the subject of sovereignty. Sovereignty is essentially the ability to self-govern. And I think that what many of us are missing when we don't feel empowered in our lives is a sense of sovereignty.
Yeah.
We don't feel permission, or we believe other people are taking our sovereignty from us. Maybe we feel like our circumstances don't allow us to be self-governing. But we wanted to have a bit of a conversation around this concept of sovereignty because I think that we are socialized to see this maybe even the opposite of how it actually works.
Yeah. There's a story from my childhood. When you say this, I think about this story. My grandparents had like this little space in their basement when I was a kid where there was like a little bathroom and a showering area off the side of their basement. And I remember being I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And my grandfather I think it was me and my brother were staying at his house, and my two girl cousins who were about 2 years younger than me, they were probably 6 or 7 at the time. They were at the house also. They were in the basement. And my grandfather, I was taught, growing up, you respect your elders and who's telling you what to do. You basically listen to what they say and you follow direction, right? So my grandfather says, Joel, Jason, me and my brother's names, it's time to get ready for bed. I need both of you to get showers. And Joel, you're up first, so I need you to get a shower. I need you to do it right now. And my girl cousins were kind of in the basement with us as we're like in this area. And he's like, please do that now. And there was like really no changing area. And he didn't like secure the perimeter. I was like 8 and I didn't know I had the permission to ask to have my girl cousins like leave the basement area. So I just started getting undressed like around my girl cousins, not thinking I was able to like say anything about this at the time. And it felt weird at the time. I didn't think I had permission. I just turned my back. I got undressed. I jumped in the shower. But I remember feeling like at the time, I gave my sovereignty away. I mean, I didn't have those words when I'm 8 years old, but looking back on it, I think I have pain around that still. Like I was kind of embarrassed I had to do that, quote unquote, had to do that, right? Probably if I'd given my grandfather pushback, he was a very gentle man. He wasn't abusive to me. He wasn't demanding anything. I was just taught to respond to authority. When you get told to do something, you do it. You don't question that authority.
Yeah. I have one similar, actually. I'm sorry, were you?
No,
complete?
yeah. I mean, I'm saying like that's an example of something where I feel like my sovereignty was given away really, not in a malicious way. It just felt like it was taken from me in some fashion.
Yeah. Mine is a little older. Mine is like more like 12 years old. And this was when I first hit puberty and I was starting my menstrual cycle. And I think it was maybe, I don't know, the second or third month of my menstrual cycle. And
so brand new for you.
Very new for me. And my parents were pretty open about sexuality and sex and menstrual. I mean, like, any, puberty. And it wasn't like there was any shame around talking about those subjects at home. But I didn't really know that I could engage in those kinds of conversations with anybody else outside the home. And so I wasn't prepared. I started my cycle. I totally wasn't prepared. And of course, it was visible because I had no protection. And as I just happened to be wearing a crop top, which was like super inconvenient. And I didn't know what to do. And I didn't know that I could go to the office or to the nurse's office to say what had happened. I didn't know that they would like assist me. I had no idea that they would send me home or call my parents for new clothes. Like I had no idea that I could even do that. So I walked around all day long with a trapper keeper, like sort of shielding my butt the whole day. And of course that wasn't successful. So some jerk caught it and he just started making fun of me all day. And I was so humiliated. I was just like completely humiliated. And I felt like I gave my power away that day too, because of the level of shame. It was like, I didn't know in this institution that the institution didn't trump my personal needs. Like I had no self-sovereignty because I felt like I had to respect the institution of school to the point where I didn't interrupt their process in order to get my personal needs met. And I felt the same way. I felt like I had handed my power over. I wouldn't have been able to say it that way at 12, But that's the feeling I had. The feeling is I had handed my power over to this institution and I couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, and you fast forward into adult life. I've had experiences, in a past relationship where there were certain things demanded of me. There were certain, I guess, power dynamics at play where I feel like, quote unquote, in trying to do the right thing, I feel like I handed over a lot of sovereignty, probably because of how I was raised, and also just I'm wired to try to create win-wins, but not always, people don't always honor that when you hand your power over. Often that can be abused or misused, and someday I'll probably talk about my story around some of that, because I think it would be an interesting story that I think would help people. I don't think I'm ready to do that yet in detail.
But you keep hinting, so that means you're close.
I'm close as I do more healing work. Anyway, long story short, it's like this idea of when you later on go, I don't know if I feel good about the power I gave away or the sovereignty, and this idea of sovereignty, this ability to self-govern or self-regulate or have control over oneself. I think it's how we're defining it, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't feel good about it later, and then you have to reconcile that and think in terms of, man, I feel like that was taken from me. And we were talking offline before this podcast that we're not sure that's exactly how it works. We're not sure we're actually getting it taken from us. It is always our choice in a lot of ways.
I think even as children. Sorry,
that's good. No,
I keep starting to talk when it looks like you do an inhale of breath, so I don't mean to talk over you.
I agree. I think it is when we were children.
Even as when we're children, it doesn't feel like we have even, we don't have any power or control as children. Like, we basically are told to obey or we face the consequences. And I think even as children, we actually have sovereignty. I think we have sovereignty at every moment in our life. In fact, I think that sovereignty is not something we gain. I don't think it's a skill we build, as opposed to everything else we talk about on the podcast. I'd say everything is a skill that we build. But sovereignty, I think I experience that is inherent. We have the ability to govern ourselves however we want to. And anytime sovereignty is not in our possession, it's not because it was taken, it's because we gave it away. Mm-hmm. And I even mean situations like, like if for some reason law enforcement was to bust into the house and drag me off in, handcuffs, and I was to be imprisoned for the rest of my life, that would feel like I didn't have sovereignty. It would feel like it was taken from me. But fundamentally, I get to decide how I experience all of that. I get to decide my attitude, my emotions. I get to decide what I believe is the most important component, which is my perspective of reality. That's fundamentally mine. And if somebody feels like they're in control of that instead of me, it means I handed them the control over my perspectives.
So we're not talking about physicality. Like somebody could take sovereignty over your actual person, your body. You're in a back alley somewhere and they mug you. Maybe they hold you up by a knife or a gun and they rob you at gunpoint. I mean, I guess you have the choice to turn and run and get shot.
Right.
So you still have sovereignty of choice there.
Yeah.
So by staying and handing over your wallet or your purse, you are in effect, you're choosing that.
Yeah.
But what if they come and they hold you down and they rip the purse away from you or pull the wallet out of your, you don't have the choice to run away and get shot. I guess what you're saying is the narrative based on that and not the physicality, because obviously you're physically being held down, so you don't have sovereignty over your physicality.
Yeah. And fundamentally, when we talk about sovereignty, in fact, I just saw a conversation around sovereignty online, and the person was talking about how they feel like they give their sovereignty away a lot, or they're not sovereign. I don't think usually we're not talking about our physicality. I mean, I think there are times when you can be like a ward of the state, or you can, like you mentioned, be in a violent altercation where the other person has physically overpowered you. In those situations, you don't have physical sovereignty if you can't say move because somebody's got you completely in an embrace, or they have you unable to move.
Sure.
Restrained is the word I was looking for. And so there are times when you might not have physical sovereignty, but really our perceptions are defining our reality. And so we are experiencing reality according to all of our lenses and filters. And the majority of them have been socialized. Most of those filters and lenses are socialized. And so to some extent, we hand over our sovereignty in that way as well. But I think that's what I love about doing development work and understanding maps and models so much, is that we incrementally gain more and more control over those filters and lenses. And we get to a place where if there is the capacity to truly influence our own perceptions of reality, that's where I believe sovereignty lives. And that is ours.
Yeah.
Like, that is intrinsic and inherent inside of us, that ability to gain that sovereignty.
So what we're actually talking about then is obviously, and I think the reason why I went to the physical part, and you talked about prison, and I talked about getting assaulted or robbed, is because that's where first people go. It's like, well, what about that? And I guess the spirit of this conversation is those are extreme examples, and we're not really going to deal with, but even those extreme examples, you can still control the narrative. It's more about the things that aren't extreme examples. You know, you're at your mother-in-law's house for Thanksgiving, and you don't claim your personal power. You do something, you give in to your mother-in-law, not you, Antonia, one gives into her mother-in-law, and then you feel bad about it later. You feel like you gave up a piece of yourself in a social dynamic. I think that's more of what we're talking about, because that's the stuff that happens on a daily basis for you listening. You know, that those times when you hand yourself over to someone and you're like, I don't feel good about that.
Usually it manifests, I think, in allowing other people to control our behavior.
Yeah.
When, like you said, when somebody wants us to do something or they don't want us to do something, and our will or desire is to do the opposite, and yet we still bend to them. And it feels like we are lacking sovereignty, which is interesting also in that that's a narrative as well, because I don't feel like I lack sovereignty. I don't feel like I hand it over to anybody anymore. I used to do it all the time. In fact, I would say that was like the majority of my growing up experience was handing all my sovereignty over to everybody else. Like, everybody else got to determine how I was going to live my life. And when I finally graduated from that way of being, I totally went the polar opposite, which is like, I'm not going to let anybody control anything I think ever again, which of course is an illusion. It's an unreality. But it was an illusion that served me, because it made me start pursuing lots of maps and models and different ways of experiencing the world. So it was a good place for me to like sort of polarize. But amongst that is this idea that while I probably am handing my sovereignty over to lots of different things, I never feel that way. I never feel like anybody else is in control of me. And I think it's really more about the feeling than anything else. When you feel like you've handed your sovereignty over to others, you feel disempowered, and you feel sometimes shame. And like, what kind of person are you to just hand it over to other people? You don't feel like you have your own personal power. And regardless of whether or not I actually am handing my sovereignty over to others, I never feel like I am. I always feel like I'm able to have my sovereignty within me, which is why I think it's actually more of like a state of feeling. And that's intrinsic. Like, you can just kind of hold that within. You don't have to feel disempowered. I think for me, this idea of like somebody taking it, I think that's really where we have this misnomer. I think that's really where the perception of somebody taking our sovereignty from us might be one of the most disempowering thoughts we can have, because we feel like we're sitting ducks then. Like, almost like our sovereignty is laid out in table, and we're just hoping that by other people's goodwill, they won't just scoop it up and take it from us.
Sure.
And I don't feel like our sovereignty is laying out there. I feel like our sovereignty is sort of inside of us, and we grab handfuls of it and hand it to other people. And what's interesting is contrasting this with this idea, like you can do the exact same behavior and have two different feelings from it, which is, let's say you're in a relationship, you and me, Joel. Let's pretend you and I are in a relationship. More on that later. Let's say that you want me to do something that I don't want to do, and I do it anyway. There are two different narratives that I can cast here. I can think that I'm handing you my power and control and my sovereignty, or two, I could think that I'm compromising in behalf of the relationship. And those are two totally different narratives, because in the first one, I didn't feel like it was a choice. I feel like you took it from me. And in the second one, I acknowledged it was a choice and I chose to do it for the sake of the relationship. And I think that the first narrative of it not being a choice, that's where the feeling comes up of not having sovereignty. That's where the feeling emerges of being out of control or handing other people control.
Sure. So there's an example of this, like in our life, actually our dynamic, and this is just a basic daily example. Let's say, so we have our 5-year-old daughter, Piper. She's almost 5, and you and I work from home in our business. We have childcare for her, right? Like right now, she's being watched as we record this. But sometimes we don't have childcare, so we have to get work done regardless of Piper not having childcare. And what we'll often do is take turns. Like I'll watch Piper while you do a little work, and you'll watch Piper while I do a little work, or something like that. So, this dynamic's actually come up with us where I say, hey, I will offer, right? I'll say, hey, why don't I watch Piper while you work on Project X? So you toddle off, you work on Project X, and you are getting stuff done. I'm watching Piper. And then after it's over, you come back and you're like, do, and we finish the rest of our day. And the next day comes and I need to do some work. And maybe you don't offer. Maybe you've got something else going on, or you and Piper have to do something together, or whatever it is. But or I and Piper have to do something together. But so you don't offer. And then I start to get bitter. I'm like, well, I just offered yesterday to do the watching Piper part while you work. How come she's not automatically reciprocating? And maybe I took a hit for it the day before. Like maybe I actually put aside some of the work that was really critical to get done. And you're not automatically reading my mind that, hey, this was critical and I took a huge hit for you yesterday. And so all of a sudden my narrative is, man, I gave away something really important. I gave away my sovereignty here because I took the hit to watch Piper on your behalf. And you're not cataloging this. You're not watching for the reciprocation of this to make sure that I get some time to finish my stuff. And then I get bitter and resentful maybe and like stompy around the house because you're not offering without me having to ask. Now I ask, but you've got something else going on. You can't watch her or whatever's going on. Maybe you've got a call scheduled. You can't reschedule, whatever. And now I feel like I took a hit on something. It was not really prearranged. I just, from my own volition, offered. But now I feel like I took a hit and you're not reciprocating. And then I could start to create a narrative out of that, maybe, that you took something from me. You took my power because you went ahead and indulged yourself on something. Or maybe you even requested me to watch Piper. That's even more like it, to get something done, but then you didn't offer to do it the next day. These are little microtransactions. And I say, took sovereignty, quote unquote. I put air quotes around that. And you listening might be like, really? You think of that as losing sovereignty? But this is the kind of stuff that comes up for us as humans, right? We go through life and these little tiny hits in our relationships, our friendships, parent-child dynamics, whatever it is, we take these little hits and then we get resentful or bitter about it later. And we say, I gave a piece of myself up. I don't feel good about that now. And it's almost you're hoping the other person's keeping this scorecard to balance the records later in a way, right? That's one way of seeing it. So I just, from a micro transactional standpoint, like I've seen that come up for us. And then I get like kind of fussy about it. Like, hey, come on, why aren't you doing this? So I think that's an example of how this might show up in life in like every day. We're not necessarily talking about like abusive relationships or super intense stuff. It can happen on a really basic level in your everyday life.
Yeah, like you're maybe an acts of service person and you find yourself constantly doing acts of service for others.
Yeah.
And you don't feel like there's a sense of reciprocity. So then you feel like you just have to go do whatever, like you've built this dynamic where you feel like you have to do whatever everybody else tells you to do, or fill or meet their expectation, no matter what that is. And then it feels like you don't have sovereignty because you're, especially if you're a person who has extroverted feeling or harmony in your function stack, this can definitely come out, which is this idea that you're supposed to be serving all the time, right? Like you're supposed to be constantly in service to other people, and and their needs are on your radar. And well, hey, what about me? And nobody's doing that for you, and so then it feels like you're always, in other people's control. But as you're talking, I think what's coming up for me is this idea that no matter what we're doing, unless you're in prison, right, or in solitary confinement,
sure,
right, or in a North Korea or something where the country of your origin is completely locked down, like unless you're in like a dramatic situation, we pretty much have a lot of freedom to do whatever we want to, really, like for the most part. In most countries, we have a lot of latitude around the behaviors that we are allowed to engage in. And also, in particular, in our relationships, we have a ton of freedom. So when we choose to do something, what we're generally doing is we're honoring some value of ours. And that includes when we make a choice to do something we later resent. Like when we make a choice to have other people's needs on our radar and constantly be filling them regardless of whether or not they asked. Or if we're the kind of person who feels like if that scorecard isn't balanced, and that means that I took the hit because you weren't noticing my need, and now I met your need and you didn't meet mine, then I gave my power over to you, right? Because it's not a sense of reciprocity or whatever the situation is. Or we just are obedient in whatever way we define obedience. We are actually honoring a value within us. In the case of like you and your grandfather, even at 8 years old, you were honoring the value of obedience to elders and relationship over personal privacy. And so you took the hit in personal privacy in order to honor obedience and relationship, which makes sense at 8 years old if that's how you've been programmed. For me, I was honoring the value of not interrupting an institution, which seems like a weird value to have. But as a kid, I was raised to see the institution as the most important thing. And I'm just a cog in a machine. That's basically how I was raised religiously. So you don't go interrupt the flow of the institution. That's wrong. You just take the personal hit on that. So I chose the higher value of not interrupting the institution and took the hit of humiliation, or like not having like the ability to be private as well, personal privacy and the ability to have dignity. So as children, usually we're on the receiving end of these values. Like they get massaged in our heads and we obey them. But as adults, I think the most interesting question is if you feel like you're handing your sovereignty over to others, and I say that, of course, as opposed to them taking it, what is the higher value you're trying to observe? In the case of, sharing time with Piper in order for the other person to get work done, when you do that and are resentful, are you honoring the higher value of the relationship and trying to keep conflict away at the cost of industriousness and being able to get your stuff done? So we're all doing that. And I think what's empowering about that thought is that we remember that the control is fundamentally in our hands. We're the people who get to choose that. And the solution isn't to tell people to stop taking our power from us, because that's also an illusion. The real power lies in figuring out what are the values you feel beholden to. What's the higher value you're trying to obey at the cost of personal satisfaction, industriousness, right? Dignity, getting your needs met. Like, what is your higher value that you're trying to observe and obey, which is still within you? So you still have sovereignty. You're still serving yourself. You're just serving a value system that you might be blind to.
Yeah. I think most people, and you listening might resonate with this, I think we end up giving sovereignty over because we don't want to be seen badly by others. I think it's mostly, I'm trying to think of examples that it wouldn't be around relationships. If let's say you're in a group of ladies and you're one of the women in the group of ladies and you kind of volunteer, okay, I'll be the one to, every time we meet once a month or whatever, I'll be the one to bring the cookies or whatever. I'm just pulling a random example, kind of making up out of my head. I'm trying to think of like something like people I've known that struggle with, like you commit to that. And you do that every month, and you're realizing like no one's helping. You're ending up doing this. The fear is, well, if I say, hey, this is unbearable for me, I can't do this anymore. The feeling is you get kicked out of that group of ladies that's getting together. If you're like in a group of women and you're one of the women in that group, and that's your role. You're like, if I stop doing this, that's my value I bring. They won't be in relationship with me maybe anymore if I say no, or if I say this is too much. And so you just continually take the hit. I mean, this little micro transaction, right? Like bringing cookies to a get together once a month. That's kind of silly, right? But this actually happens for people. They commit to things, and then later they're like, why is no one honoring this? This is wearing me out. If I say no, all these people will stop being my friend, and I'll lose relationships. So you're listening right now and you're going, yeah, I identify with something like that in my life. And that's fine and well, Joel and Antonia, to take the power back into my hands. But then I lose the things that are important to me, relationships or whatever else.
Yeah. I have a mildly better thought out metaphor than the cookie lady, just because while you were talking about the cookie lady, it gave me an opportunity to think about a different metaphor.
Okay.
Though I like the cookie lady.
I don't know. I was just trying to think like something like my mom would have struggled with growing up. Like,
that's totally your mom thing.
You know what I mean? Like she would have committed to something, and then she would have been like, it would have stressed her out, and she would feel like people wouldn't like her if she didn't keep doing that or something.
Your mom is totally the cookie lady. I could totally see why you would choose that.
Which stems from a place of endless service and amazingness. So I just want to make sure, if Mom, you're listening, I'm not being critical at all. I'm just using it as an example.
Your mom might be one of the best human beings I've ever met. So that's why she'd be the cookie lady. She'd be the cookie provider. Well, I was actually thinking of like a boss, like an employer-employee situation.
Yes.
Where the employee has a value that makes them want to say no to the employer, but then they've got this higher value of, say, eating, right?
Their job.
Their job, safety and security. And so they don't feel the sovereignty to be able to say no to something that might be harming, say, an ethic. And so now you have these battling values, which is the ethic, if you feel like it's harming your conscience to do whatever it is that the employer is asking of you, versus the ethic of being able to, say, support your family or support yourself. And so we have battling values all the time. And I think that's why it's so important. I think the first step is just awareness that that's what's going on. Awareness that you're honoring different types of values, and to ask yourself, whenever you feel a lack of control or sovereignty, ask yourself, what actually is the value I'm serving? Because you're not handing your sovereignty over to another person. You're handing your sovereignty over to a blind value. Not a blind value, a value you're blind to. So you're still serving yourself. You're just serving a part of yourself that you're not as familiar with or is deeply unconscious for you. And so bringing those value systems out into the light and then asking yourself, is this really a value that is worth it to me? And like you said, when that happens, you're going to end up taking some hits. When you decide that the value of, say, dignity or conscience or, personal, just getting your needs met, when that starts butting up against other people's desires and wishes for you, you will have some fallout. And so most of the time, like you said, people's higher values are things like not wanting to ruffle feathers because they don't want to get booted from the tribe, which is a really ancient fear. Or they don't want to lose their job, which is also an ancient fear of survival. Most of these are attached to ancient fears. And we're not living in ancient times. We're living in modern times. And modern times make it so that if we ruffle some feathers, we're probably not going to get booted from the tribe and, say, die from exposure. And if you talk to your employer about something hurting your conscience, you're probably not going to get fired over that. But we don't know that in the fears, the value systems that are deep, 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 deep inside of us, we don't always know that. So it's really good to pull them into the light and go, what is the value that my sovereignty is serving that I'm not as aware of? And is it one that I really want to be serving, or is it one that's rooted in, say, a concept of fear that's no longer relevant to the modern context?
So I guess I want to pivot and let's talk about some ideas on, I think this higher value thing's a really great strategy. Let's talk about some things we can do in our lives to begin to take some of that sovereignty back. When I say take it back, quote unquote, with the definition or the way you're talking about it, we always have it. It's not like it's never there. It's what value are we honoring? I think that's really a great framework, basically, that we've had the choice all along. It's where have we placed it? Which value have we tethered it to? I think the other thing is your auto response is slowing things down. You spoke about FJs earlier, extroverted feeler types. So all the FJs in the Myers-Briggs system, I think they have a natural response. I've seen this time and time again to just automatically say yes often. And boundaries can sometimes be tough. because they want to serve and show up in a way that really gets needs met. And so they tend to say yes faster than no because they want to show up as good people and help get needs met and things. So I think, part of this is, depending on your personality type, you may need to basically slow the process down before you say yes. Maybe something simple like, hey, let me think about that. Can I get back to you in 20 minutes? Just go out of the room or something else and let yourself think about it for a second to make sure you can actually meet the need.
Yeah. Well, and while you were talking about that, because I don't think it's just FJs. I mean, I'm an ENTP and I've got extroverted feeling as my tertiary or 10-year-old position. Like, it comes up for me too.
Comes up for me too.
Yeah.
I know that that's a particular struggle for FJs.
Well, and I was going to say people who have introverted feeling, which is something that you have as your auxiliary or co-pilot process, introverted feeling has a challenge with feeling like it's losing sovereignty whenever it makes a concession because its desires are so intrinsically wrapped into its identity. And so I think no matter what type you are, you're going to have one of these two processes. And of course, sovereignty is it's like a feeling. It's a feeling of sovereignty, which is why I kind of tried to graduate from that whole the concept of, do you actually have sovereignty or you don't, on kind of a philosophical level? Because we're not really talking about the philosophy of whether or not we're truly sovereign, if we have free will, etc.
It's the narrative.
And it's the feeling that comes from the narrative. It's like the emotion that we're really trying to control. So the emotion is going to come from an emotional place or from a feeling place, which is going to be one of those two processes. And every single type has one of those two processes somewhere in their stack. So, or in the car, if you look at the car model. So for extroverted feeling, it feels like you're handing your power over to everybody else through like service and not, maybe making healthy boundaries and deciding to get your needs met. For introverted feeling, it's whenever anything hits your identity and you're like, oh, I made this concession. And especially like I've noticed with you, Joel, especially if you made a concession to something and you ended up feeling like you were right or vindicated. In that moment, you particularly feel like you handed your sovereignty over. And I think for me, it's been more about doing things for everybody else and handing the power of my life over to others. That was really where my sticking point in sovereignty was. So for me, it was like a holistic system of handing myself over. And for you, it has been a lot of those microtransactions. And I think for introverted feeling, it can just feel like whenever you make a concession for somebody else, and you as a person who's using introverted feeling, you might be doing this a lot. You might feel like you have no personal power or sovereignty because you're doing this all the time. So I think for introverted feeling, it's more about getting a handle on what is actually a lack of sovereignty versus a basic compromise, right? And I think that goes back to, again, choice. Did I choose to compromise in behalf of, say, a relationship? Or do I feel like that wasn't one I should have handed over? Like that wasn't one that I should have compromised on. And that can be sticky for introverted feeling. Just like for extroverted feeling, not just like going out and serve can be sticky and difficult. And I think that they're both sort of, they've got their own challenges. I think they both have components to them. Like introverted feeling, when it finally sticks to conviction, it doesn't hand its sovereignty over at all. You cannot budge it. You cannot move it. Like that is about as sovereign a place as a person can get. So that's one of the nice things that comes from introverted feeling. Whereas extroverted feeling more has to build a system of it. And so I think they both have their challenges. Yeah,
I would say for extroverted feeling, for both, insecurity is going to be an issue, right? Like a lot of times we hand our sovereignty over because we feel insecure in our own personal power that we've got what it takes and these people might not like us or this thing may not happen or whatever. I think for extroverted feeling, though, it's definitely a place of feeling like if you lose, like be okay with the idea of losing connection. Not that you will lose connection, but if that happens, then you have to be okay with that to have that personal power. Otherwise, other people influence how you show up. And I think for introverted feeling, it's taking little ego hits, micro ego hits throughout your, like unattached micro ego hits. And that's going to be tough sometimes if you haven't built the discipline for that, to take those hits and feel like you're losing a little bit of your
like your identity,
because it's what's going to end up happening is it's not so much handing your sovereignty over, it's these compromises and things. So it's almost like introverted feeling can sometimes be I wouldn't say too sovereign. I don't think that's the right word, but it's definitely locked into like this has to be this way, or it's not. It can't be at all. In a way, it's like a either or situation. At least that's how it's been showing up for me a lot, and I've seen it in other introverted feeling users.
And when introverted feeling doesn't have that component, then it feels like it has zero sovereignty.
Yes.
Like it just hands its identity over to anybody. And that's like probably the most depressed state somebody who uses that process as a strength can be in, is that they just have zero identity and zero ego.
Yeah.
And so there's like, I think you're right. I think a big piece of it, if you're going to go to the how-to, is first find that place of unattachment, not detachment, but unattachment. For extroverted feeling, unattachment to the outcome of the connection and relationship. Like if you stand your ground and go for what you want and the person leaves you, then that's going to be okay. Right? That was probably not a sustainable relationship to begin with.
They left the real you.
Yeah.
I mean, do you really want to be somebody you're not just to stay in relationship with them?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying it. And then with introverted feeling, it's unattachment to the ego and unattachment to the identity piece. And being willing to become a different person, which just like with extroverted feeling, being unattached to a relationship that was not sustainable, I think with introverted feeling, it's being unattached to this concept that your identity is static.
Yeah.
It's not, it's plastic. It changes all the time. So sometimes you just got to go ahead and take the hit. Sometimes you just got to go ahead and take the compromise and allow your identity to change and morph and shift based on that.
I just want to make a quick note. If you're a new listener and you're following along here and you're a thinker in the Myers-Briggs system, you're going, well, why, I'm a thinker. You're not talking about thinking at all. You're talking about feeling. What is this introverted, extroverted feeling? What are you talking about, guys? We're actually talking about what's technically called cognitive functions. If you head over to personalityhacker.com, you can find more information about this. If you type in the search bar, the car model, there's a few articles that will help describe what we're explaining. And both of these technically called cognitive functions live in our personality, and both of these feeling processes or one of these feeling processes will be in your personality, and it's technically called a cognitive function stack.
Yeah.
So even if you're a thinker in the Myers-Briggs system, that 4-letter code, you will have one of these feeling processes represented. It's not going to be represented as a strength for you. It's actually going to be one of your less developed processes, but it does show up for you. And it actually, in some ways, especially in relationship, can be a challenge because it's not as obvious to you. You don't have as much skill built. And in some ways, I would say thinkers may have more challenges when they're in a close relationship. Often in your life, you may not go through daily life feeling like you give away sovereignty. But when you get in that really close pair bond relationship or family relationship, sometimes because those people in those intimate relationships have more access to the deeper parts of you, that childlike part of you, those feeling processes can really be jerked around in some ways. And you can feel often like you're giving away your sovereignty, maybe even more so than you realize, because that's just how you're wired. So I just want to mention that if you are a thinker, these parts of you are there too. It depends on which type of thinker you are, but these are represented in your personality. Yeah,
well, and those people have wormed their way in.
Yeah.
And once they're in, it's really hard to not do whatever you can to keep them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because connection is not that easy to experience for thinkers, I think. Anyway, I think going back to this idea of what can you do about it, I think it's just a series of awarenesses and then observing your behavior and then giving some pattern interrupts. This idea of when you feel like you've given your sovereignty away, the first thing the pattern interrupt you need to give to yourself is, when you feel like your sovereignty has been taken, the pattern interrupt is, I gave it away. That's the first one, is it can't be taken from me. I only give it away. And then the second piece is, I didn't give it to the other person. I gave it to a value within me that I'm blind to. A value that's coming up from a dark place. So now I need to go figure out where that's coming from. And then the third piece is, what kind of sovereignty giving away situation are you in? Are you using extroverted feeling? And so you have a tendency to be more service oriented and not create those healthy boundaries. And even like Joel said, even if you're a thinker, this might just be showing up in maybe your pair bond relationship. And if you're using introverted feeling, then is it a matter of taking all these ego hits and like maybe feeling like you're handing your sovereignty over, giving it away because you feel like things should be a certain way. And then just being aware of how you operate, like being aware and then adding a pattern interrupt, which is maybe I need to figure out what my authentic true value system is and be conscious and aware of it, and then start behaving in alignment with it and go ahead and take the hit in the outside world.
Yeah. So what do you think? You've been listening. We want to hear your story. We want to hear your perspective. Maybe you have a question. You want to come over and ask us. Go over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a question or ask a comment directly below this show.
That's the opposite. You can leave a comment or ask a question.
What did I say?
You can leave a question or ask a comment.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
We've been doing a lot of recording today. We're working on a new program at the time of this recording. And so this is the end of the day. And so my brain is starting to like cross my wires, I think.
My fingers are crossed that any of this made sense.
I think it did. I hope so.
I hope so. It made sense to me. Isn't that? Yeah. Does anybody listen to this podcast? I think this is just for us, right?
No, I think we got a few listeners out there. So anyway, if you're listening, you want to leave a comment or ask a question, said it right that time, head over to personalityhacker.com. You can also join our community of like minds. It's growing every day. We continually have people requesting to join that community over at facebook.com/personalityhacker. Or you can also find us at twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And if you enjoyed this program, podcast, end of the day.
See what I mean?
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving to two sorry saps who've had a very long day of recording, you can leave us a rating and review and not mention all the ways in which we've made mistakes, but just talk about the good stuff, which is we may or may not have made sense in this podcast. And that would help us out a lot.
Yeah, my name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.